All SAS operations were cross-border. We weren't expected to undertake any operations inside the borders of Rhodesia. Our function was very much to try and disrupt the activities of the terrorist forces or the guerrilla forces, and to sort of try and sort of nip them at the bud, so to speak. Our function was very much one of being a thorn in the side of the guys. We were trained to go sort of, I suppose you could call it behind enemy lines, although it wasn't a conventional situation. So the enemy lines weren't really drawn in any specific way, but they had bases and they had administrative structures and things like that. And the more we could disrupt that, and the more we could destroy their infrastructure, the better, obviously, it was for the end result, because it meant that their logistics got thrown out, they couldn't resupply and things like that. So our job, to a large degree, was to ensure that the infrastructure at base was taken out and was disrupted as best we possibly could. So that's why we used to go do sort of observation posts over camps where they were housed, and then from the information we could draw from that, monitoring movement, monitoring weaponry, monitoring the kind of vehicles they had, whether there were women and children in the camp, whether they're in a whole variety of different bits of information that were needed. We would then take that information and we'd glean back, and that would then be sort of put through the system, and ComOps or special branch or military intelligence would use that information. And then from the information, we would then, an attack would be planned. We were invariably involved in that attack. But we did a lot of other stuff, but the crux of it was to disrupt their logistics, because, logistics, resupply, having weapons at hand, etc., and being able to monitor, or sort of being able to structure their war effort, if you want to call it that, was obviously paramount. And so where we came into it was that we went to go and change all that for them.
Now, I remember reading about a big attack in Beira. There was a lot of newspaper articles about that at the time. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, there's actually quite a history to that, John. If you'll bear with me, I'm just going to go through the history of that, and I'll take you right through to the op that I was talking about previously. In 1976, Henry Kissinger came to South Africa and basically put a gun to John Foster's head, based on sort of oil supplies and a whole variety of other stuff, with the threat of embargoes on our ports, etc. And his deal was, look, we want to get rid of the Rhodesian problem. So get Mr. Smith to come and chat to us. And of course, Foster got on the phone. Smith came down to South Africa, and the deal was, we will give you 2 years in which to implement majority rule in Rhodesia, and you're not going to get any help unless you agree to that. And South Africa was basically stuck in a corner. So there's a bit of betrayal all around, and I mean, politics as it was, and politics as it always is, got into be a bit of a dirty game, because Rhodesia was totally dependent on South Africa for support. They were sanctioned from the rest of the world, and South Africa was their real, there were sanction busting operations, things like that. But that really put Rhodesia in a corner, because suddenly they were, South Africa was going to withhold arms and ammunition coming through. They were going to withhold fuel. They're going to, and so South Africa suddenly became, they weren't as much of an ally as they had been, by necessity, because I think the nationalist government had been put in a corner by the American government. And I mean, the double standards of the American and British politics is well known. But that was where they went to. So moving on from there, Smith was forced into trying to do a deal. He invited Nkoma, invited Mugabe. Neither of them accepted the invitation. They said it was going to be on their terms or no terms. So eventually they had an internal settlement between Chief Chirao, Bishop Muzarewa, and I can't remember that guy's name, but there were 4 parties, and including the Rhodesian Front. That settled the whole thing and led to an election which put Abu Muzarewa in power as prime minister. And that was a UANC. Okay, the UANC was United African National Council, as opposed to Congress in South Africa. With that, the war was escalated because both Nkama and Mugabe, as a patriotic front, saw themselves as being potentially ousted from this. So their response to it was to escalate the war. And Mugabe went to China, who was their major supporter. And bear in mind that Zandler was the greatest threat than Zipper, because although Zipper were far better fighters, they were coming through from Zambia. Zandler had the greater numbers, and they were far more ruthless in terms of the abductions of young people and things like that. So they had far more cannon fodder than what the Zipper guys had. And Zandler was a great threat to the whole scenario because obviously because of the eastern border coming through with Frelimo, which was a communist government, and which is what the whole thing was supposed to be fighting against. They didn't want a Frelimo government, or should I say, they didn't want cooperation between a government in Rhodesia or Rhodesia's Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, with Michel. But I think that was quite an aside thing, because whilst Michel was supported by Russia, Mugabe was supported by China. So we went to China and arranged for a massive arms delivery. It was huge. And the idea was that they were going to be able to sort of really just chuck these arms into the war effort, and with ammunition and new kinds of equipment, etc. That was really going to be disastrous for Rhodesia. And the intelligence mechanism, and I mean, we had what they call special branch, and we also had military intelligence, and there were a variety of mechanisms working behind the scenes. And they started to pick up on this information that this massive arms delivery was due to come in. Now, Beira, because of its location, and it's central Mozambique, and gave access to Manica and Tet provinces in Mozambique. And that is where the concentration of most of the sort of guerrilla movements were. Mugabe and his henchmen were mostly based in Maputo, but all the heavy camps, all the major supply routes and things like that went through the Beira corridor. So it made sense for any arms and ammunition and equipment to be delivered to Beira. Now, Beira is a river port. It's right at the bottom of the Convoy River, and the river flows into the sea at Beira. So as a result, you've got a lot of silt, which basically builds up in that basin. And the result is you've got to have that, it's got to be continuously dredged. And the dredge has got to work there 24/7. Otherwise, it silts up. And the result is that bigger ships can't get into that port. They just run aground. So in order to make sure that that the ship was going to be heavily laden with arms, I mean, apparently I don't know what was on that ship, but there were vehicles, there were armor vehicles, armor cars, masses of arms and ammunition and so on. So it was heavy, just sitting low in the water. And in September 1978, they put an operation in place, which sadly I missed because I was qualified as a diver, but a diving team, which didn't include me, and I knew nothing about it at the time, went in and did an operation into Beira. And what they did was they laid limpet mines underneath the dredger, and then they went and they did a bit of a job on the fuel storage depot there while they were about it. But the long and the short of it was that, and they were assisted at the time by MRM, which is the Mozambique resistance movement, which were being trained by Rhodesian forces anyway. So there's a whole political thing. The resistance movement was fighting Michel, but in an operation like that, the assistance was drawn from them. So went in and blew up the dredger so that they could know, and they blew it up in such a way that it blocked the harbour. So they could no longer dredge the harbour, and also big ships couldn't come in there. That job was designed to stop these Chinese ships, which are carrying these huge amounts of arms and ammunition into Beira Harbour. They then would have to go to Maputo because that was the only alternative port that they could actually use. So work started to get underway to find out, where those ships were, when they were likely to dock, and so on. So, and eventually they docked in late November 1978. And apparently there were about 3 or 4 ships. I don't know. I'm not sure. But they offloaded all these arms and they put them on board a train. Well, it wasn't one train, it was a number of trains. But there was a good train line that ran all the way from Maputo all the way up into Tet province. And that train line had never been damaged, at the railway line. It was a good service. It was in good condition. It carried passengers and goods from Maputo, imported goods from Maputo, which was basically the port, and all the way up into Tet and Manica province. In fact, it was a supply route for practically the whole of the interior of Mozambique. Intelligence coming through at that time indicated that these arms were being offloaded in Maputo, and that they were going to be loaded on board a number of trains that were going. So a team of SAS guys got together and they went in, and there was a bridge in Manica province. There's a bridge that goes over a gorge. It's not actually even over a river, but it's over a gorge. They decided they needed to destroy that bridge in order to stop that train from getting up. But having said that, they wanted to destroy the arms at the same time. So they wanted to, if they had just blown up the bridge, they would have taken the train to a point, brought another train from somewhere else, and they made a plan to get it across into, across the gorge into the, onto the other train. So the team that got together, they went in and they laid explosives underneath the bridge and did a command detonation as the train was approaching. So the train disappeared into the gorge, along with all the ammunition and arms and so on, which gave a backup team from Rhodesia the opportunity to go in and go and claim those arms. We used helicopters and things like that to go and get as much of it as we could. But there was only a portion of that shipment on board that train, and the balance was going to come up by road. Now, the road system in Mozambique, the long-distance road system, was actually not bad. It was actually pretty good. They had the roads that had originally been built by the Portuguese had been quite well maintained, and particularly because of the Frelimo War, where they were also still battling along, and they kept those roads in pretty good condition. And I was part of a team which was sent in to go and take out that convoy of vehicles which was going to be bringing those arms up. And the way it worked was that we had been monitoring the progress. Obviously, because of the sort of need-to-know system that everybody worked in, we never knew what other guys were doing. Sometimes it would come out and, we'd say, well, the job was done. That was when everybody knew it had been done. But leading up to it, and I must say that there was a tremendous amount of good discipline in that, because, we'd be good mates, but we wouldn't be talking to each other about an ongoing op or an upcoming op, should I say. We might have well got the information, but we didn't sit in the mess and talk about it. So there was a high degree of confidentiality and a high degree of secrecy, and we were all really sort of subject to the Official Secret Act anyway. But it was drummed into us, if you loose talk is just so damaging, because it spreads a lot quicker than you think it would. But secondly, it gets distorted, and the next thing there are rumors, and everybody's got the wrong end of the stick, and it just becomes a balls up. So whilst there was, I suppose, a little bit of sort of chatter amongst troops in certain units, I don't know, I was never part of them. Certainly from an SAS point of view, there was never, ever any discussion about upcoming ops. And when the guys have just come off an op, you just say, how's it? Nobody asks, where have you been? What have you been doing? How are things going? Who did you blow up? Who did you kill? It was never part of a discussion, which is strange, because we were all part of the same thing. We were all doing pretty much the same kind of work, but we never asked each other what you've been doing.
Say those are ops coming up. How long before the ops would you be briefed? When would you start to get information about the ops, and how would you train for that ops?
Depending on what the op was. We would be brought into doing rehearsals, into retraining, but what the actual detail, the admin and log, there's a thing called SMEEC. Okay, it was situation, mission, execution, admin and log, and then communications. SMEEC would be left right till the end. We, for example, whatever op was coming up, for the bridge op, for example, they would be taken to a bridge somewhere in Rhodesia, which would be a similar style or similar type of bridge. And they'd go and they'd lay down, move in on it, do the whole operation. And then, but you'd never know what you actually been rehearsing, what you're rehearsing for, up until the time we were ready to go. If, for example, when we did that Chamoya raid in 1977, we did a lot of house clearing, going in, back up, move in, put what we used to call knock-knock charges on the doors, which would blow a door off, things like that, and that kind of rehearsal. But we'd never know what we were actually rehearsing for. I mean, it could be one of a million things. You can guess as much as you like. In a situation where rehearsals were done, they were done so that you were sort of in charge of what you were doing, but you wouldn't know what you were going to be doing. And then the actual briefing of what the op was going to be was always at the last minute. And then they'd get the guys together and they say, right, situation. And the situation was, what are we faced with? And then M, which is a mission. Our mission is to, and they would give us basically details of what the mission was for. Okay, and then E was execution. So this is what our SAS Operations, this is how we're going to do it. Okay, A is for admin and log. The administration, your logistics, what your backup is, logistics, this is how we're going to pull you out if you get into trouble, this is how we're going to resupply you, all that sort of thing. And then C is communications. What means of communications are we going to be using? We always used to use what we called the TR-48. They were great big things. A radio guy used to carry it on his back. It was a horrible thing to have to carry because it weighed a ton. And there were also awkward things to actually put up because you had to sort of get the direction of where you were going to be sending your signal to. We'd have to sort of put a direction so our Salisbury's that way. So you'd have to turn the thing and have your antennas so that they were facing in a particular direction. So it was quite a mission. I mean, if you're in a hurry to put that thing up, now guys got it down to a T, they could get the whole thing set up in about 2 minutes. But even 2 minutes when you're in a lot of trouble could be a long time. Today, you pick up your cell phone and say, help. It's a slightly different type of way of doing things.
And did you always talk in code?
We very rarely used voice. It was always on Morse. And in Morse, we had button and shackle. And what you'd have is you'd have your alphabet running across and your 1 to 10 or 1 to 9 or 0 to 9 running underneath that. And above and below, you'd have the equivalent of button and shackle. So button, so you'd be going like, the guy sending his message on Morse would actually prefix what he's going to say by BTN. And so if BTN came up, they would know that they were basically in shackle, in button, and then SCH was shackle, or SKL I think it was. So if the number of letters SKL came up, so you'd swap between button and shackle. So in other words, you'd like ABCs right through to Z, you'd have alternative numbers and alternative letters above each and below. So button would be one set of letters and shackle would be another set of letters. And then your 0 to 9, you'd have a series of alternative numbers in shackle and button. So when you're sending the message, you then prefix it by BTN, and then the signal on the other side would recognize that as being, you're using button for this, and they'd put like 3 words in the SKL, and then they'd be looking at the shackle of equivalent. So, by doing that, you confuse practically anybody. It's very, very, and they would change every day. So it was very difficult to sort of try and track the thing to see exactly what kind of code it was. I suppose good code crackers could probably have done something with it, but they'd actually be pretty quick. And I think it also varied from unit to unit. I think, and I don't think we all, if your call sign was Bravo 20, you might be using a different set of codes to Bravo 21, for example. It was very, very difficult for anybody to crack the kind of codes we were using. Not that it really would have been all that important. We weren't, when we were on ops and we were out in the bush, we basically we'd give our position. We always gave our position right up front. So the guys at base knew where we were. So obviously that was important, that we could actually code that so we could figure them out. But the kind of things we were doing, we were, we weren't a long-term operational thing. Our ops were invariably pretty short. frequently we would go in and do long-term ops where we would be doing intelligence gathering on routes and things like that. So we've sort of been dropped and pulled out and dropped and pulled out. We'd go from one place to another, so very often on foot. Or alternatively, they'd bring in some choppers and pick us up and take us to a different area. But we wouldn't be brought back to base prior to sort of going on the next leg, and then they'd resupply us. So the kind of things we were doing, apart from sort of letting everybody know where we were, we didn't want that to happen. So that could lead to quite a lot of trouble. The operation, just coming back to what we were doing on the sequence of events that led to the op that we're going to talk about, is that the briefing will be given just before you're ready to set off. Okay, so we were then, the bridge had been done. The guys had gone in, they'd done the bridge, and the train beautifully fell into the ravine. Unfortunately, there were people on board that train who probably wouldn't have survived. Those arms had to be destroyed, and whatever we could in the interest of sort of trying to maintain some kind of superiority, we had to have those arms on our side. So anyway, once having blown the bridge, intelligence then came through that there had already been an alternative plan to bring some of the weapons up by road. But the plan then had to change, because then they had to bring all the weapons up by road. What was left, because that train line was no longer, that railway line was no longer functional. And I certainly couldn't get it up into Teto, Manica province. That bridge was taken up a bit further south. So we were given a briefing, and well, I remember it was we hit the convoy on the 16th of December, but it was right early in December where we got the briefing, and we were deployed on the 4th of December. And we were deployed from Grand Reef, which was near Umtali, and we were taken down to Umtali. We were deployed from there. We were deployed by helicopter into an area which was about 25 k's away from our site, from our ambush spot. And then we walked in from there. Well, we would have been dropped at last light and then walked at night. Unfortunately, the moon phases were in our favor as well at that stage. So we actually got quite a good amount of walking done at night. And then we would lay up during the day and just sort of keep sentries out and so on, and then walk at the we did most of our movement. We didn't walk in like that at that distance. We do most of it at night.
Going into ops like that, what sort of kit did you take with you? Well, what would you have been carrying? What food and what sort of weapons would you plan for an operation like that?
Planning for that op, we knew more or less what we were going to be. The plan was to dig up the road and lay a mine, to set up claymore mines right across at the back end of of what we believed would be a convoy. We weren't sure how big the convoy was going to be. We didn't know how many vehicles were going to be in it. We did think there might be 10 vehicles. But what we needed to do was to basically disrupt the convoy and stop it. And whether that was by leaving wreckage in the road or whatever, so that the vehicles couldn't get past. And then the deal was that the Air Force would take care of the residue. But what we would carry with us, we would carry a mine. We didn't want more than that, because, that's also quite heavy. And on that particular op, there were 12 of us. So there were 3 call signs. I think we had 10, I can't remember, I think we had 10 claymores with us. But then also, because these were going to be command detonated, we needed long lengths of flex, of electrical cord. It was just ordinary flex, the kind of thing that you do a lamp with, sort of a table lamp. We had 2 RPG rockets with us, 2 RPGs with rockets, which we were able to strap to our Bergens. So the launchers themselves, we had 2 of those. And I think we would probably have carried about 8 rockets. That gives each person was a launcher, and I was one of the guys who used a launcher on that operation. 4 rockets, but I'll get to that in a minute. Obviously your kid, your food, rations for the period, and we were pretty seasoned in terms of how how we could sort of diet that we could live on and how we could sort of pace ourselves in terms of food and so on. Obviously, water was an important one. There wasn't an easy source of water close by. So, we carried as much water as we could. And the deal was that we would split away. We'd get a group of guys to split away, to go and fill up water bottles. And I think the nearest water source was about 5 kilometers away. So we'd go there and fill up water bottles, and then the guys would carry all the water bottles back. Basically, that's basically it. Obviously, small arms, normal ammunition. I used to carry well, all of us did basically carry a full magazine on your rifle, plus 4 magazines in your chest webbing, and then probably about 100 extra rounds, which would be 5 boxes of 20. But we used to put those into plastic bags, roll them up, and put them into a pouch on your Bergen, which was reasonably easy to get to. But that was for your personal protection, small arms fire, and things like that. And that was basically what it would have been. Then batteries, obviously, and then your communications equipment. We'd need to take spare batteries for the radios. Somebody had to carry that. And then always, there was a medics pack, which would consist of drips and certain types of antibiotics, things like Reverend, for example, which was always used as an intravenous means for gut shot wounds. If anybody sort of shot in the guts, your guts tend to spill out and become sort of leads to septicemia. Reverend was an antibiotic which was specifically designed to fight that or to combat that and to stabilize that kind of condition until you get the guy back and sent off to hospital. And you always carried for the worst case scenario. And they planned for the worst and hoped for the best. And it was always the same. We planned for the worst possible type of scenario, and then hoped that we would, obviously not need half the stuff that we took, particularly in terms of the medics pack. Like that.
And then, Ian, you were dropped off, and then how far did you have to walk per night? What was the expectation of how far you had to walk?
We would probably walk about 10 Ks a night. It would vary. This particular op, we actually made good ground because it's quite a hilly area. It was quite a sort of the bush is not really, really thick in that part of the world, but it's actually quite an undulating sort of part of the world. It's just, obviously it's very rocky and so on. The vegetation, it's quite lush, but it's not like that sort of really heavy sort of bush that you get further south, which it's very difficult to navigate your way through. So we were able to walk at least 10 Ks. It took us 2 nights, as I recall it. It took us 2 nights to get from our drop-off point to our position, to our ambush position. And then when you get to an ambush position, particularly if you arrive there in the early hours of the morning, spread out, go, and everybody needs their sleep. So we would then work it out, and a couple of guys go and have a few hours kept, while the others kept their eyes open. Then you'd swap, and then we'd start to work out where we were. We had a pretty good idea. We didn't have satellite images and things like that, but we knew, we were all pretty good at map reading and that sort of thing. We could more or less judge the kind of terrain we're going to be in just by looking at a 1 in 50,000 map. So we had a pretty good idea of what to expect when we got to our ambush site. Once we got there, then what we did was we did a recce up and down the road for 4 Ks, back and up, to try and make sure that we were actually alone. We weren't, were there locals? Was there any activity? Was there, what sort of activity was there on the road? Obviously, we could monitor the road just by being close to it, but actually looking to see whether or not we had any company close by, and we didn't. And then what we did is we set about, and then it started to rain. On day one, it began to rain, and the rain started to come down, and it rained, and on an ongoing basis, it varied from monsoon to a steady drizzle, but it didn't let up for a minute. It rained all the time we were there. We were there for 10 days. But what we did then was we went out and we had a 4-pound hammer and a chisel, one of those big builder's chisels. And with that, we started to chop into the road. We dug a square, which is about a foot square, foot by foot by foot, get a slab and lift that slab out without crumbling it, and you put it to the side. And then underneath that, it was actually quite easy to dig. And we'd then lay our mine underneath that. But then we laid it quite close to a culvert, because what we had to do, we had to run the wires from it across, because, they drive on the left-hand side of the road in Mozambique. And we were on the right-hand side of the road. That was where our ambush position was going to be. So we had to then run the cord across away from our position and down underneath. There was a drainage pipe underneath the road. We pulled it underneath the drainage pipe and took it all the way up 50 meters away on the other side of the road to where our command detonation was going to be. And then we got that laid and put that down. And then we set up a whole lot of claymores about 1 kilometer further back. And that was all the way down. So what the plan was going to be was that when this convoy arrived, we'd let the first vehicle come through and wait and let that hit the mine. Wait until that was over the mine. We'd detonate the mine. And then another team further back would detonate claymores in very much the same way. We had all the deaths were wired to a single battery unit. So the claymores would be detonated. Now, the claymores are, they are a sort of a concave thing, like a convex, should I say. So it does this, and then when it blows out, it does this, and it's full of shrapnel, ball bearings, and God knows what. So anything standing within about 50 meters of that is going to get seriously damaged. And when you're doing a vehicle ambush, clearly you want those things to hit the tires and as much of the vehicle as you can. It's the actual detonation force. The force of your detonation is in the claymore. So you're not going to get fire going out of it. It's not like something like an RPG, for example, or a rocket. When you fire it, it actually detonates when it hits its target. The claymore detonates when you trigger it. So that would just blow all this shrapnel out. And if you've got 10 claymores lined up, there's a lot of shrapnel going out there. And over a distance, you probably did immobilize maybe 3 vehicles, because, their tires would just be totally slashed. So that was the setup there. So we had the mine up front, we had the detonator, the claymores back. And then we went back and we waited. And then every day we'd do a recce out just to see and any vehicles coming up and down the road, we would actually monitor to see what they were. But it was very, very quiet. I was thinking that all the time we were there, we probably saw 5 vehicles. And they just drive up and they drive past mostly civilian vehicles. One occasion was a big Pantechnicon truck that looked like it was carting furniture or something, but we weren't sure. And in fact, that vehicle very nearly got taken out because we weren't sure whether this was part of an arms carrying thing, which is entirely possible. What better vehicle to put it in than a Pantechnicon? So we were unsure. But we had 2 guys sitting as early warning above us, because we were in the area that we actually in was actually quite mountainous. Actually, it's a lovely part of the world that day. If you're there for different reasons, you could actually really admire the scenery. These guys sitting on the gomo behind us were basically wasting their time there, because they couldn't see past the edge of their sort of position, because the cloud cover was so low. And we were below that cloud cover, but it was bucketing with rain. And it just rained and it rained and it rained and it rained. And how uncomfortable that is. One, it sort of makes you realize why they put you through that pre-rev before selection, because that, kind of what it does, it tests the resolve of the people who are going to end up in the kind of situation we're talking about. To sit in the rain with no cover, you can't put up a tent, you've got nothing to keep you dry, everything is wet. Your bergen's wet, your clothes are wet, your weapon's wet, you can't dry anything. The only thing, what we always used to do, most of the guys were smoking. I was certainly a smoker in those days. And we used to get these little plastic soap boxes. They were not dissimilar to a Tupperware thing. And we used to put our cigarettes in those and find a little spot in the bergen for that thing. And that was an important part of the kit, actually. And I used to have a little soap box, which is a plastic soap box, which fitted perfectly into my pocket. I used to keep the packet of cigarettes that actually happened there, and that was always dry. I made sure that they were dry. So that was the one dry thing that we had. Nothing else was dry. And you talk about misery, John. When you've got nothing to do, so and we always used to take books with us for this type of operation, because you're waiting. You can't read because your book's going to get wet. So and you're just sitting there, and your morale has been destroyed, and it's raining, and then the rain starts to let up, but it's just a steady drizzle, and then an hour later it comes down again. But when I say monsoon type stuff, it's amazing. And that time of the year, you've always got these cyclones coming through the Mozambique Channel. Sort of ended up between December and April. Sort of cyclone season. And this was the tail end of one of those cyclones, and it just rained and it rained and it rained. And you want to know misery. After 5 days, we say, we're getting on the radio, tick, 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 tick. Hey, guys, this convoy is not coming. Convoy's gone. They just say, stay where you are, it's coming. Stay where you are.
Could you heat a cup of coffee or not at all?
We had those little hexi cookers, which are those gas cookers. You can buy them in ME stores or anyone like that. They actually just punch at the top of them and you screw a little stovetop thing onto them. And we could do that. You could basically, we had what they call, old-fashioned poncho. So you sit and you've got your poncho on, but your poncho is so wet and your clothes. But if you hold the poncho over the gas cooker, it stops the rain from getting. So at least you can heat the water. But that solved our water problem, because what we did underneath you used to get these mugs, the water bottles to fit into, and we never used to carry those because they became cumbersome. But you'd keep one because you could cook your food in it and you could eat your coffee in it and so on. And we just used to leave those out, and they were being filled up almost like within half an hour they'd be full. So we certainly didn't have, you just empty that into a water bottle, but we didn't need to do that all that often because, as I say, the rain was constant. I've never had to be in a situation like that again or before. Whoever goes and sits in the rain for 10 days, and I think you've got to be crazy to do that. But anyway, we did. And then finally and I remember the date, it was the 16th of December, because I knew my brother was getting married on that day. It was a public holiday in South Africa, and I just remember the sort of association always sticks with me. Early in the morning, it was on 4 o'clock in the morning, we were shaken. Well, I was, because you could actually crawl into your sleeping bag and wrap yourself up, and then your body warm up the water in the sleeping bag, and you actually had quite a decent kip. So, sleeping you got used to it. Anyway, about 4 o'clock on the morning of the 16th of December, we could hear the vehicles. We could hear them in the distance, and you could hear that, and we could hear that it was a lot of vehicles. And then there was quite a steep hill coming up to where our position was, and these vehicles now started to churn up this hill. We could actually hear them changing their gears down, and battling. So we thought, well, this is perfect.
Can you maybe just talk about, at that time, you could hear these vehicles coming, you don't know how many there are, there's only 12 of you there. What was that like? What was going through your mind?
Well, obviously, the anxiety starts to build up. It's now showtime. And, we'd been sitting there, and by the time it's all started, we were totally relaxed in our little spot, apart from the fact that it was raining. It was actually we felt totally comfortable. We were able to sort of chat to each other and sort of go on. And so we were almost like at home. And then almost like, your unwelcome visitor, the guy you don't really want to see, is coming to knock on your door. So you start to get, obviously, the butterflies start, the anxiety starts. So you hear these vehicles, we had to then go and get into position. So the guys who were going to hit the claymores, they basically they pushed off, and we had to go down onto the road. Now we were positioned about about 100 meters from the road. This is where we had actually put up our sort of little base with our defences and all that sort of thing in case we ran into trouble. And so now we had predetermined our positions for each of us knew exactly where we were going to go when showtime came. And I grabbed myself and one other guy. We both had RPG rocket launchers with the rockets. And so we grabbed that, obviously a rifle as well. So we're a bit cumbersome at this stage. Moved down to the road. Now, bear in mind, when you've got to, it's very difficult to try and think about what the other guy's thinking. You're more or less, the tendency is to think about how vulnerable you are. And this is what gives you the nervous tension and the anxiety and so on. But when you have thought about it, and it's been drummed into you by training and things like that, if you're driving at night and you've got trees on either side, bush on either side of the road and so on, what you see is what's on the road, generally speaking. You very rarely see what's on the peripherals of your lights. And when it's raining, you're concentrating more on the road. You've got your windscreen wipers going, so on. So what is on the side of the road is unlikely to draw your attention unless it's something obvious, like somebody standing there with an RPG-7 rocket launcher. By just remaining on the road, staying as calm as you can, and just waiting for the right moment, and then just standing up and letting go. It's you anticipating that moment, because you're thinking at that point in time, obviously, somebody's going to see me, somebody's going to shoot at me, and you start to think about what can go wrong. But at the same time, you've convinced yourself that, I'm not going to be seen. How can they see me? It's dark, it's pitch black, it's pouring with rain. And here comes this guy, and try and put yourself in his position if you were driving that vehicle, or if you were a passenger in that vehicle, or if you're a guy sitting at the back of the vehicle, supposed to be escort or whatever, And there were escorts in the middle of the convoy. There were no escorts in front, strange enough. So the first vehicle that come past was a covered vehicle, so we then positioned ourselves in where we had, we looked at this thing. We had 10 days to work it out, and we knew exactly where each of us had to be. And then we waited for the vehicles, and then the guy who had the command detonation, all he had to do was touch a terminal to a battery, boom, and that was going to detonate the mine. And the way they used to work, the way we worked that was when we laid the mine, we would put it directly in line with an object that you could actually see, and we'd take it back to the point of detonation. So the person who was actually going to detonate it would actually have that object in line. So I know exactly where that is, in line with my mind. So, and that object would obviously be kept in sight. And then as the vehicle gets to that object, so you touch the little terminal to the battery, and boom, up goes the mine. That's instant. There's no delay on it whatsoever. And so as soon as that mine went, so then the rest of us jumped into action. And the vehicle's coming up. I got up and I laid one rocket into a vehicle that was coming up, and that I hit it at the back behind the cab. And there must have been explosives in the back of that or something. That went up in a mushroom of flame. And the guy that I was with did the same thing. And those are the only 2 rockets we got off. It would have been an interesting exercise to see how, because they detonated the claymores as well. So we had the front vehicle, which was gone, the vehicle I'd taken out, which was the second vehicle in the convoy, and then the third vehicle had been taken out as well, also by a rocket. And then there were a couple of vehicles between them and the claymores. And there were personnel on board at least one of those vehicles. Immediately this had gone in, we started to draw fire. And, then the AKs and all the Chinese weapons, Russian weapons, actually fired green tracer as opposed to the red tracer that's fired by NATO weaponry. So this green tracer, then, it's all of a sudden the whole place is lit up like a pyrotechnics thing, these trace of flying around. They didn't know where we were. We knew that. We had already worked out our withdrawal. So we hit the vehicle. We had burning vehicles. We had one which was totally destroyed, and that one wasn't burning. That was the one that had gone up with the mine. That was, it was just a wreck. And then we had one which was two that were burning, and then the others which had also been damaged quite severely by the claymores. And we hadn't exchanged any small arms fire. They were firing at us, but they didn't know where we were. So there were five. This trace was going everywhere, all over the place. And we then withdrew back to our position where we, and at any time, our kit was ready to pick up and go. Because for a number of reasons, firstly, if we had been compromised, we weren't going to sit around and start digging up the mine and taking down the claymores and things like that. The case of picking up and go. If for whatever reason we needed to move. So the only thing we ever had out of our packs was something that we were physically using at the time. And then, at night, obviously, you've got your sleeping bag. And when those vehicles would come in, we'd been in our sleeping bags. Those of us had been sleeping. The guys on guard, obviously weren't. But I think they were probably in their sleeping bags just to sort of try and get that warmth out of their body warmth because it was so wet. And I basically chucked my sleeping bag over my Bergen. And when we drew back to our position, just simply a case of squashing out the sleeping bags because they're fairly compact. They were very warm. I didn't roll it up properly, just shoved it in and then picked up our kit and we were gone. And what we did was then we moved away and we'd also plotted our course to get out because behind us was quite a steep hill, quite mountainous, and we had worked out a path. We went back along this path and back up to, because at that stage of the game also what we had done was there was a predetermined code which we would just basically allow base to know that we had hit the convoy. So that message had gone out and the radio had been packed up and we were sort of packing up. So from the time we hit the convoy till the time we were basically moving out, probably about not more than 10, maybe 15 minutes tops. And then we made sure everybody was back with us. So one guy who later, very sadly, not on that op, but very sadly, the one guy who'd gone down to go and check on personnel coming out of the mine, the vehicle was hit by a mine. He ran into a bit of trouble because he was shot at, but I think he took out the driver of the vehicle, but he was delayed, and we thought he had been taken out. So we were waiting for him to get back, and we thought at the time, shit, we have to go looking for him. We're going to be in a lot of trouble. But then he appeared, and he was okay. So we then all pulled out and disappeared. But that particular guy, the very next op, in fact, he went out and he didn't come back from that, which is very sad. But we then withdrew, and by this time it was probably about 4:20 in the morning, and it was December, so it's the middle of summer. So the lights started to get light, and bear in mind we're quite far east now, we're quite close to Beira. So it started to get light at about 5:25. And then we pulled out back so we could actually see where we were going. We just went up and did a dog leg behind the hill that had been behind us, and then came over, and it was a climb that took us probably about 2.5 hours. And we got to the top of this Convoy where we were then able to overlook the road that we had just done quite a lot of damage to. And we called in the Air Force, and they came in with 2 Lynxes and 2 Hunters. The Lynx was a converted Cessna. I'm not sure what they used to use them for, but they used to call the Greeks used to call it the plane with a hole in it, because it looked a bit like a vampire jet. It was just basically a tube with a double tail, and when you looked up at it, it looked like it had a hole in it because it was, you had the tail at the back and so on. But they were very maneuverable aircraft. They were great, and they were used extensively by the Air Force. So they brought in those, and it was actually quite an interesting watching these guys, because they came in. The hunters, 2 hunters came in and cleaned up the vehicles that were still on the road. Just put extra rounds into them, and one vehicle from the hunter strike blew up. I mean, we don't know what was in there, but obviously what was ever in there hadn't been damaged by our activity. But the hunters hit that was a direct hit. But the rest of the convoy turned around and gone back. There's a little town called Gura, which is about 5 kilometers south of where we were.
Can you estimate how many vehicles were there and how many managed to turn around after the ambush?
We destroyed 4 of the vehicles. Well, I think we disabled 6 of them, basically. 4 were totally destroyed. And then disabled another 2, that were damaged by the claymores. And I think there were 12 vehicles in total in the convoy. And actually, they were quite well spaced further back. So what we were faced with then was, we had these vehicles and there were personnel which are now basically disembarked from the vehicles they were being carried on. And they had gone into attack mode, but we had disappeared by that time. And I think they were chasing shadows. We then, as I say, we went back and we came up the back of this mountain and onto the top, onto sort of plateau, where we could overlook the road. And suddenly the clouds had disappeared, the rain had gone, it was a beautiful morning, perfectly clear blue sky, and up came the sun. So something that had been concerning us throughout the op was that if this vehicle convoy arrives, we won't be able to call in air support to destroy what we couldn't destroy because the cloud cover would be too low. So that was obviously a concern. And what happened was, as it turned out, somebody was on our side that day because the day dawned absolutely perfect. It was a beautiful, beautiful morning. And then we had a bit of a sideshow while we watched the Air Force come in and take out, because they'd set up an anti-aircraft weapon next to one of the vehicles. And the one aircraft drew fire, but I'm sure these guys weren't properly trained on their weapons because they got a missile. It drew a bit of fire, then I think there was a weapon jam because it sort of fired a couple of rounds and then stopped, and then you got a guys messing around with them. So what had then happened from the time that we had actually hit the convoy, and we had, as I said, it had taken us about just over 2 hours to walk away and come back up and around to where we were. And then to direct the vehicles, the airstrike into it. What they had done was the vehicles behind those that were immobilized had gone back into Gutu and had taken cover under trees. There was an orchard there where they had parked their vehicles. And the guys were looking for them. And then one of the pilots was quite a well-known, sort of a bit of a Yahoo guy, a hell of a nice guy, but also quite a daring sort of guy. And we could hear him on the radio saying, "I can see the bastards." And then he guided them in, and then they took out the rest of those vehicles in that convoy. And so that, so that had its origins from early in the year, because once that internal settlement was signed, is when they decided it was time to escalate this war. And that's when they did that deal when Mugabe went to China. They arranged for this whole shipment of arms. The sequence of events that followed that was to stop the ships from coming into Beira, because that was far too close to where they were going to be delivered. And then to try and stop those vehicles, stop those arms from getting from Maputo to where they were destined. So, it was just to give you an indication that, things weren't sort of done, focused on the spot. It's sort of step away from the vacuum and see the big picture. And the big picture was, it actually started, just one of a many, many sequence of events which came about as a result of that internal settlement. And it was just one string of events which basically occurred and brought us to that point of destroying that convoy.
How far did you have to walk back before you got picked up?
Once we were up on the hill where we were, we sat and watched the Air Force taking out what was left of the convoy. They brought choppers directly into our position, and we brought them round and back behind the hill. And so they weren't approaching directly over the road. They approached from behind the road. Sorry, from behind the feature that we were on. And we were able to clear a DZ there or an LZ, a landing zone, for the choppers to come in and pick us up. So, and then we went back and we got back to base that night, and we in high spirits, because it was having been a bloody miserable 10 days. The way it actually turned out was it couldn't have been better. It worked in our favor in every possible way. It was total surprise. We were in the right position. The mine did, the guy who detonated the mine did it absolutely to perfection. The destruction of other vehicles, the vehicles being where we wanted them to be so that we could actually destroy them with the rockets that we had. One of the things that concerned me when I fired that rocket was whether I was not too close to the vehicle. Because the thing, as it turned out, it was whatever was in it was because I could actually feel the percussions once it went up. But you're always concerned, this thing blows up. It's not going to blow me up with it. But it was probably 100 meters away from me when I fired. So, it's quite a decent distance. Unfortunately, my aim was good, and it hit it. I'd actually aimed for the cab, but it hit it behind the cab, sort of between the cab and the back of the vehicle. And that's probably the better shot, because it was where it hit. It went straight into the back of that vehicle where all these, whatever was in there. We were assuming there were explosives in there because that vehicle went up in quite a bang. And then other vehicles, there was another vehicle behind that also burst into flames, and we could start hearing the pops. So I think they were probably carrying quite a lot of small arms ammunition in those vehicles, because those then started to explode. Once the detonators got hot and those small arms rounds started to, then it sounded like fireworks display going off, or something, with a whole lot of guys on the range, because the bang of each round was actually quite loud. So you got and you could actually hear them going off. So and then eventually there was just one big bang. So it would have been a lot of them going off together. So that was just one of many, many ops, and the sort of planning of it, the execution of it, and then the withdrawal afterwards. And then, it was pretty much how we functioned, how we operated, and what it was the kind of job that we would have been tasked with in order to ensure that we disrupted their logistics as best we possibly could, and minimize their, as it turned out, it was, they had, Zanle in particular had endless cannon fodder. They really did. I don't think they trained their troops properly. A lot of the troops didn't want to be there. A lot of them had been abducted from schools and things like that inside Zimbabwe. A lot of them were very young. So they didn't really have the enthusiasm that would have been required of. But I'm talking about the sort of the run-of-the-mill guys. Those are the kind of chaps that could just keep on pushing into the field and pushing into the field. There's some very, very dedicated commanders and some very dedicated soldiers amongst them. But the kind of operation that they ran, it doesn't matter. It didn't matter how professional we were, how good we were, how well informed we were. It really didn't matter. They could just keep coming at us and keep coming at us. If you take the current situation with Russia and Ukraine, Ukraine are making a huge fight of this thing. But as time goes on, Russia will just keep pushing more and more and more stuff until they overwhelm them, which is sad. And that's exactly what happened in Rhodesia. The thing is, we weren't overwhelmed militarily. We were overwhelmed politically, largely by double standards and hypocrisy by Britain and the US at that time. But as I say, they could have kept that war going forever, because they just had this endless stream of. So that's at the end of the day. We commanded operations such as the one I've just spoken about. But at the end of the day, it was a war that was unwinnable. We couldn't have won that.
They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.